conference room smelled faintly of polished oak, fresh coffee, and expensive perfume, a place where fortunes changed hands with the stroke of a pen. Around the long mahogany table, distant relatives exchanged confident smiles, already imagining vacation homes, luxury cars, and overflowing bank accounts. Their whispered conversations carried effortless certainty, as though the inheritance already belonged to them. At the far end sat Emily, her worn handbag resting beside her chair, fingers clasped tightly together. Dark circles framed her tired eyes, silent reminders of sleepless nights spent balancing bills, comforting her children, and wondering how she would survive another month. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, opened the final pages of the will, and began reading each beneficiary's share. Gasps of delight, grateful laughter, and satisfied nods echoed through the room as names were matched with generous estates, investment accounts, and priceless heirlooms. Emily listened without expectation. She had not visited hopping for wealth. She had come simply to honor someone who had once shown her unexpected kindness. Finally, the lawyer spoke her name. He paused long enough for every face to turn toward her. To Emily Carter, the estate leaves the sum of $1. Silence lasted only a heartbeat before scattered chuckles rippled across the room. Someone covered a grin. Another cousin laughed openly. The sound spread until nearly everyone seemed entertained by the cruel simplicity of her inheritance. Emily lowered her eyes and forced a fragile smile that hurt more than tears. After everything she had endured, somehow life had found one final way to remind her how little she mattered. She quietly stood, picked up her handbag, and walked toward the door. Her hand had barely touched the brass handle when the lawyer's calm voice stopped her. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "if you would please wait, the reading is not over." Only a year earlier, Emily had believed her life could still be repaired. Then her husband walked out the front door with a single suitcase and a promise to send money when things settled. Weeks became months, and the promise disappeared as completely as he had. What remained were overdue mortgage notices, unpaid utility bills, and two frightened children asking questions she could never answer honestly. Every morning began before sunrise. She cleaned offices while the city still slept, spent afternoons stocking shelves at a neighborhood grocery store, and accepted evening bookkeeping jobs whenever they appeared. By the time she returned home, exhaustion clung to her like a heavy coat, yet she always found enough strength to help with homework, cook simple meals, and kiss her children goodnight with a reassuring smile that hid her growing fear. There were evenings when she quietly skipped dinner so her son and daughter could have seconds. Without noticing, the pantry had almost nothing left. She learned to stretch every dollar until it seemed impossible to stretch any further. Somehow, she always found another way. The relatives gathered inside the law office had never witnessed those sacrifices. To them, Emily was simply the family disappointment, the woman whose marriage had failed and whose clothes never looked expensive enough for their holiday gatherings. They arrived in tailored suits, stepped from luxury cars, and spoke confidently about investments and vacation homes, barely acknowledging her existence unless it was to offer polite pity wrapped in subtle judgment. Yet hardship had shaped Emily into something none of them understood. Every setback had strengthened her resolve instead of breaking it completely. She had lost a husband, financial security, and nearly every certainty she once believed in, but she refused to let her children lose hope. Even now, standing in that elegant office after being publicly humiliated, a quiet determination remained beneath her heartbreak, waiting for the moment life finally gave her a reason to believe again. As Emily stood frozen beside the door, her thoughts drifted far from the polished law office to the quiet little cottage where Margaret Whitmore had spent the final years of her life. Most of the family referred to the elderly widow only when discussing her considerable wealth. Birthdays were forgotten, holidays passed without visits, and excuses always seemed easier than making the short drive to see her. Emily had never understood that. Long before her own life unraveled, she had begun stopping by every Saturday with homemade soup, fresh bread, or groceries Margaret could no longer carry herself. When arthritis made simple chores painful, Emily mowed the lawn, replaced burned-out light bulbs, and repaired loose cabinet doors. She never kept track of the hours because she never believed kindness should come with a price. Those afternoons slowly became something much deeper than obligation. They sat together on the old porch, sipping tea while birds chirped in the towering maple trees. Margaret loved telling stories about her late husband, the family's forgotten history, and the dreams she once carried before time quietly reshaped them. Emily listened without checking her phone or glancing at the clock, making the elderly woman feel seen in a way few others ever had. When Emily's marriage collapsed, Margaret somehow sensed her pain before a single word was spoken. She would simply place a gentle hand over Emily's trembling fingers and remind her that storms never lasted forever. Those quiet conversations became the comfort Emily desperately needed when the rest of her world seemed determined to fall apart. Curiously, Margaret rarely spoke about money. Instead, she often smiled mysteriously and said, "People reveal who they truly are when they believe no reward is waiting." At the time, Emily thought it was merely another piece of gentle wisdom from an aging woman reflecting on life. Standing in the lawyer's office now, remembering those words, she couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret had been trying to tell her something all along, something no one else in the family had ever cared enough to hear. Emily slowly turned from the doorway, confusion replacing the quiet resignation that had settled over her moments earlier. Every eye followed her as she returned to the conference table. The laughter that had filled the room only seconds before faded into an uneasy silence. Even the relatives who had mocked her now watched with cautious curiosity. The lawyer reached into his leather briefcase and carefully removed a thick ivory envelope sealed with dark red wax. Across the front, in Margaret Whitmore's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "To be opened only after Emily Carter accepts her $1 inheritance." A murmur swept through the room. The lawyer broke the seal with deliberate care and unfolded several neatly prepared documents. His expression remained calm. But there was a noticeable weight in his voice as he began to read. "Mrs. Whitmore anticipated today's reactions," he said. "She instructed me that the $1 inheritance was never intended as a punishment. It was a test." Several relatives exchanged nervous glances. "A test?" one cousin interrupted sharply. The lawyer ignored the interruption and continued. "Margaret believes that true character reveals itself when a person believes they have received nothing. If Emily accepted the $1 with dignity and chose to leave peacefully without demanding more, I was instructed to proceed with these final documents." The room became so quiet that the ticking grandfather clock in the corner suddenly sounded deafening. Emily stared at the lawyer, scarcely able to breathe. He placed another document on the table. "Mrs. Carter, you are the only beneficiary eligible for the second phase of this inheritance." A collective gasp spread around the room. The lawyer adjusted his glasses before reading the final instruction. "You have exactly 7 days to claim an undisclosed property owned by Margaret Whitmore. Failure to appear in person within that time will result in the entire inheritance being permanently transferred elsewhere." For the first time that afternoon, the confident smiles disappeared from every relative's face. And Emily realized the $1 had never been the end of Margaret's final gift. It had only been the beginning. The lawyer reached for the final folder resting beneath the opened envelope and carefully slid a faded property deed across the polished table. Its yellowed pages carried the marks of age, while an old county seal shimmered beneath the overhead lights. "The undisclosed property," he announced, "is Blackwood Manor." The name struck the room like a sudden clap of thunder. Emily looked from the document to the bewildered faces surrounding her. She had never heard of Blackwood Manor, yet several relatives reacted instantly. One uncle's complexion turned pale. A cousin nearly dropped her phone. Another shifted uneasily in his chair, avoiding everyone's eyes. The lawyer continued, "The estate includes the manor itself, all surrounding acreage, and every item legally contained within its boundaries." Someone finally broke the silence. "That place should have been sold years ago," an older relative muttered before quickly falling quiet. The lawyer glanced toward him but continued reading. "Mrs. Whitmore specifically prohibited the property from being listed, divided, or disclosed before today. She further instructed that only Emily Carter may take possession." Emily's heart pounded harder with every sentence. "However," the lawyer said, "this inheritance carries one final condition. Mrs. Carter must personally inspect the property and sign the acceptance documents at Blackwood Manor within 7 calendar days. If she fails to appear before the deadline, ownership will immediately transfer according to alternate instructions sealed in this file." 7 days. The words echoed inside Emily's mind. She barely had enough money to pay next month's rent, let alone travel to an abandoned estate she knew nothing about. Yet something about Margaret's careful planning told her this wasn't simply another legal formality. Around the table, the confidence that had filled the room was gone. Whispered conversations replaced smug smiles. Worried expressions spread from face to face, as though everyone suddenly remembered a secret they had hoped would remain buried forever. Emily noticed one cousin quietly texting beneath the table, while another slipped into the hallway without a word. Whatever waited at Blackwood Manor wasn't merely an old house. And judging by the fear now replacing everyone's arrogance, someone desperately hoped she would never reach it. Emily spent the next morning studying the faded map the lawyer had given her. Blackwood Manor lay nearly 4 hours away, hidden among rolling hills and dense forests where few people traveled anymore. With only a week to fulfill Margaret's final condition, waiting wasn't an option. She packed a small suitcase, loaded her children into their agging sedan, and began the journey before dawn-hopping determination would carry them farther than the nearly empty fuel tank. The first obstacle came before they even left town. Her phone rang repeatedly with calls from relatives she had barely spoken to in years. One warned that the property was condemned and ready to collapse. Another insisted the land was worthless because of endless legal disputes. A third coldly suggested she sign away her claim before she wasted what little money she had left. Their concerns sounded rehearsed rather than sincere. Hours later, another call arrived, this time from an attorney claiming to represent several family members. He hinted that challenging Margaret's will could become an expensive court battle if Emily continued pursuing the property. Though polite, the message carried an unmistakable threat. Emily thanked him, ended the call, and kept driving. As the paved highways gave way to narrow country roads, the scenery grew quieter. Towering pines surrounded them, their branches swaying gently beneath gray skis. Finally, an iron gate appeared through the trees, its rusted bars hanging slightly open despite decades of supposed abandonment. Emily slowed the car. Fresh tire tracks cut through the muddy driveway. Someone had driven there recently. She stepped outside, noticing footprints leading toward the distant mansion before disappearing beneath the overgrown weeds. The front gate creaked softly in the wind, but another sound drifted from deeper inside the property. A door slammed. Emily instinctively pulled her children closer. If Blackwood Manor had truly been abandoned for decades, then someone else had arrived before them. And whoever it was clearly didn't want to be discovered. The towering front door groaned as Emily pushed it open, sending a cloud of dust swirling through the dim entrance hall. She expected decay and ruin, yet the mansion felt strangely preserved. Beneath the thin layer of dust, polished hardwood floors still gleamed, antique furniture remained neatly arranged, and a grandfather clock stood silently against the wall, as though time itself had simply stopped. Her children stayed close while she explored room after room. In the library, hundreds of leather-bound books lined towering shelves untouched by moisture or neglect. A firewood basket sat beside the stone fireplace with freshly split logs stacked inside. Someone had been maintaining this place. Then Emily noticed a framed photograph resting on an elegant writing desk. It showed Margaret standing in front of Blackwood Manor decades earlier, smiling beside a much younger Emily, no older than 8, during a family picnic she had almost forgotten. Behind them, several relatives appeared unusually tense. Their eyes fixed on something outside the frame rather than the camera. As she carefully searched the desk, she discovered a locked journal hidden inside the bottom drawer. Tucked beneath it lay an old brass key engraved with the letter M. "Mom," her daughter whispered from the hallway. Emily hurried over. One section of the wooden wall stood slightly ajar. Pressing against it revealed a narrow passage concealed behind the library shelves. The hidden corridor stretched into darkness, lined with faded portraits whose watchful eyes seemed to follow every step. At its end stood an enormous iron door secured by an antique lock. The brass key fit perfectly. Inside, Emily found shelves filled with carefully labeled boxes, bundles of yellowed letters, property maps, and financial ledgers dating back more than 40 years. Every document hinted at transactions that had never been mentioned during the will reading. Before she could examine them closely, a loud crash echoed somewhere upstairs. The children gasped. Emily quickly extinguished her flashlight. Heavy footsteps moved across the ceiling. Someone else was inside Blackwood Manor. And judging by the deliberate pace, they already knew exactly where she was. Emily quickly locked the iron door behind her and guided her children back toward the front entrance, her heart pounding with every distant footstep. By the time they reached the porch, the mysterious sounds had stopped, leaving only an unsettling silence hanging over Blackwood Manor. The following morning, the battle began. A courier arrived carrying thick legal documents. Several relatives had officially filed a petition questioning Margaret's mental capacity during her final months, claiming the will had been influenced through manipulation. The filing demanded that Emily immediately suspend her claim to Blackwood Manor until the dispute could be settled in court. Within hours, local reporters appeared outside the estate after anonymous tips suggested a bitter inheritance scandal was unfolding. Soon afterward, neighbors quietly repeated old family rumors that painted Emily as an opportunist who had befriended Margaret only to gain access to her fortune. The accusations strung because they twisted years of genuine kindness into something selfish. Then came the most disturbing discovery. Returning to the hidden room that evening, Emily found several boxes overturned across the floor. The locked journal she had discovered only hours earlier had vanished. Drawers hung open, loose papers covered the floor, and muddy footprints led toward a rear staircase before disappearing completely. Whoever had entered the mansion hadn't been searching randomly. They knew exactly what they wanted. As Emily gathered the scattered documents, one folded letter slipped from beneath a cabinet. Margaret's familiar handwriting covered the first page, but the final half had been violently torn away. Someone had taken only the ending. Standing in the silent room, Emily finally understood why the family had panicked the moment Blackwood Manor was mentioned. The mansion wasn't simply valuable because of its land or elegant architecture. It protected evidence. Evidence powerful enough to make wealthy relatives hire lawyers, spread lies, and secretly break into an abandoned house before the truth could reach daylight. And somewhere inside those missing pages lay the secret they feared most. Emily refused to leave Blackwood Manor despite the threats, the lawsuits, and the growing fear that someone was watching her every move. Margaret had trusted her for a reason, and she was determined to uncover the truth before anyone else could erase it forever. Late that evening, as rain lashed against the windows, Emily returned to the hidden passage, carrying only a flashlight and the brass key. She carefully examined the remaining shelves until something unusual caught her eye. One brick beside the iron room bore a tiny carved letter, M, when she pressed it. A section of the stone wall shifted with a deep rumble, revealing a narrow chamber concealed for decades. Inside stood a single wooden chest covered in dust. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. There, neatly protected inside waterproof folders, were Margaret's private journals, original bank records, handwritten letters, and signed financial agreements stretching back nearly half a century. At the very top rested one final envelope addressed simply to Emily. She unfolded the letter with shaking fingers. Margaret's words revealed everything. Years earlier, several trusted relatives had secretly manipulated family accounts, pressured vulnerable family members into unfair property transfers, and quietly enriched themselves while pretending to protect the family's legacy. Margaret had discovered the deception, but lacked enough evidence to expose everyone before they scattered the assets through complicated legal arrangements. Instead, she had hidden Blackwood Manor from every official discussion, filling it with the original records that proved exactly what had happened. The symbolic $1 inheritance had never been an insult. It had been the final measure of character. Margaret wrote that anyone motivated only by money would reveal disappointment, anger, or greed the moment they believed they had received almost nothing. Emily alone had accepted the dollar with grace, expecting nothing more because kindness had never been a transaction. That was why the mansion belonged to her. Not because she needed it most. Because she had already proven she deserved it long before knowing it existed. As thunder echoed through the old estate, Emily looked around the hidden chamber with tears filling her eyes. The greatest inheritance Margaret had left behind wasn't hidden wealth. It was the truth. And now she possessed the evidence capable of destroying every lie the family had built over decades. The courtroom was packed long before the hearing began. Reporters filled the back rows, curious neighbors whispered among themselves, and the same relatives who had laughed at Emily now sat beside expensive attorneys, wearing confident expressions that barely concealed their growing anxiety. Emily entered quietly, carrying a single leather case containing Margaret's hidden records. She wasn't dressed in designer clothing or surrounded by a team of lawyers. She simply walked to her seat with calm determination, knowing the truth weighed far more than appearances. The opposing attorney confidently argued that Margaret had been manipulated during her final years. He claimed the unusual inheritance proved confusion rather than intention, insisting Blackwood Manor should be divided among the surviving family members. Then Emily's attorney stood. One by one, the hidden documents were presented before the court. Original financial ledgers matched missing bank transfers. Property records revealed fraudulent ownership changes disguised decades earlier. Margaret's journals described private conversations, suspicious transactions, and the names of those responsible. Finally, her handwritten letter explained exactly why the $1 inheritance had been designed as a test of character before revealing the manor and its protected evidence. The courtroom fell silent. Every document supported the next, until the pattern of deception became impossible to deny. The judge carefully reviewed the records before addressing the courtroom. Margaret Whitmore's intentions, he ruled, had been unmistakably clear. The will was valid. Blackwood Manor and every asset connected to it legally belonged to Emily Carter. The challenge to the estate was dismissed, while separate investigations into the historical financial fraud would move forward. Several relatives lowered their heads in humiliation. Others hurried from the courtroom before reporters could question them. The confidence that had once fueled their mockery disappeared beneath the weight of undeniable truth. Emily remained seated for a quiet moment, tears filling her eyes. She had walked into the lawyer's office, believing she was worth $1 lonely. Now she walked out of the courthouse with something infinitely more valuable than a mansion. She carried her dignity, her integrity, and Margaret's faith in her, finally proven before everyone who had ever doubted her. The first morning after the court's decision, sunlight poured through the tall windows of Blackwood Manor, illuminating rooms that had spent years waiting in silence. Emily stood in the grand foyer with her children, no longer feeling like an unwelcome visitor, but the rightful guardian of the home Margaret had entrusted to her. The work began immediately. Together, they dusted forgotten furniture, polished weathered wood, and opened every window to let fresh air replace decades of stillness. Laughter gradually echoed through hallways that had once held only secrets and sorrow. Her son eagerly repaired broken garden fences with help from local volunteers, while her daughter filled empty flower beds with bright blossoms that transformed the neglected grounds into a place alive with color. As news of the courtroom victory spread, neighbors who had once believed the cruel rumors began stopping by with homemade meals, paint supplies, and offers to help restore the historic estate. Many shared stories about Margaret's quiet generosity, admitting they had always wondered why so few family members ever came to visit her. Emily listened with gratitude, realizing Margaret had left behind far more friendships than anyone had known. Weeks turned into months, and Blackwood Manor slowly awakened. The library became a favorite place for evening reading, the dining room filled with family dinners instead of lonely silence, and the old porch once again welcomed quiet conversations beneath the towering maple trees where Margaret had loved to sit. Most importantly, Emily's children finally experienced something they had almost forgotten. Security. No more whispered conversations about unpaid bills. No more moving from one uncertain month to the next. They could dream without fear that everything might disappear tomorrow. Standing on the restored front porch one peaceful evening, Emily watched her children race across the sunlit lawn. For the first time in years, the future no longer felt like something to survive. It felt like something to embrace, built upon truth, love, and a home that had finally fulfilled its true purpose. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the trees surrounding Blackwood Manor in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. One peaceful afternoon, Emily stood on the front porch holding the small silver frame that displayed the single-dollar bill Margaret had left her. It no longer represented embarrassment or rejection. Instead, it had become a reminder that life's greatest blessings often arrive disguised as disappointments. Visitors frequently admired the mansion's elegant architecture, sprawling gardens, and priceless antiques, assuming those treasures were the greatest part of Emily's inheritance. She would simply smile, knowing they were seeing only what money could measure. The true inheritance lived in every lesson Margaret had shared, every act of quiet compassion, and every sacrifice made without expecting recognition. She had proven that integrity could outlast greed, kindness could overcome betrayal, and genuine character would always reveal itself when no reward seemed possible. Emily often thought back to the laughter that had echoed through the lawyer's office when everyone believed she had inherited only $1. Those mocking smiles had vanished, but the lesson remained. People who judge worth by appearances rarely recognize real value until it is far too late. Her children grew up hearing Margaret's stories instead of the family's old resentments. They learned that success was measured not by wealth alone, but by honesty, generosity, and the courage to do what was right even when no one was watching. Those lessons became the foundation of the home they rebuilt together. As the evening sun settled behind the rolling hills, Emily placed the framed dollar on the mantel above the fireplace. It wasn't displayed as a symbol of fortune. It was displayed as proof that faith, patience, and compassion could unlock doors that greed never could. Margaret's final gift had never truly been a magnificent mansion. It had been the opportunity to restore a family's honor, give two children a hopeful future, and remind everyone that the most extraordinary treasures are often hidden behind the smallest, most ordinary things.